This morning, we witnessed the launch of new strategy that will be delivering on Turing's overarching goals. There are three goals: advance and apply AI and data science to address national and global challenges. Second one is to build skills for the future. And final is to drive impactful public conversation. These goals build on our position and commitment to convene, collaborate, and enable interdisciplinary research across all sectors. The goals align really, really well with the goals of open research movement that a lot of us here are involved in. Our hope is to drive collective actions through open, participatory, and equitable approaches. The vision is to diversify and strengthen the role of actors, contributors, and all stakeholders in decision-making positions. This is only possible when we as individuals and team embrace the data science and AI as socio-technical challenges and join forces to identify solutions through democratic, participatory, and more socially aware governance. As you heard, I'm a senior researcher in the tools, practices, and system that Kirsty leads. I combine open science practices with the community building process. I lead a team of community managers who do the glue work. Often invisible, they bring stakeholders together. They translate information across different projects, between different expert groups, and also accelerate the adoption of best practices. I'm also a co-lead for the Turing Way. We have over 400 contributors from all around the world who have enabled dialogues. They have reevaluated system and written practices as a result. So it's a book that you would see, but there's a lot happening, again, in the background. All the activities are happening in the background. In this panel, although I'm using the term skills and practices more broadly and more loosely, it is really grounded in open research, inclusion, and accessibility. These approaches ensure that data science skills and practices enable inclusive access to the knowledge, also the benefits of scientific advancement for all stakeholders. So who are these stakeholders that we're talking about? These stakeholders are researchers, that are a lot of you in the room, data experts, also a lot of you in the room, educators, learners, publishers, funders, artists, hopefully in the room, and policymaker, as well as more. And they need to be enabled by the member states. Participants also include government and public as both beneficiary, end user, as well as contributor to the iterative process through which we improve the system. Assuming that we all work towards this shared vision, ideally all of us should know how to access knowledge, apply data science skills, and benefit from them by default. So you can leave already because you already know everything, but please don't leave. As we all know, that is more nuanced than that. It is really far away from that reality. Knowledge access or access itself means many, many things. Skill requirement and best practices for different contexts look very different. Knowing those diversity and differences, we have considered three aspects for this panel. First, ensuring that research skill, practices, and processes embeds roles of identities, lived experiences, and local knowledge. Understanding the role of top-down recommendations, policies, and investment in driving the adoption of those skills. In the sectors such as health, climate, and everywhere else, which is equally relevant for all sectors. And finally, recognizing that data science and AI skills are not widely and effectively taught, which is one of the reasons why we are working on the Turing Way and why we're having this conversation. And therefore, we should commit to providing pathways for learning and knowledge exchange at various levels. It's not just that the conversation should happen in this room. Conversation needs to happen in the community. It needs to happen in the government. It needs to happen everywhere because it affects all of our life. Our three speakers have a combined experience in all of these aspects, and I'm so honored to be sitting on the same stage with them and sharing the screen with Monica. And also, B, great job hosting this whole stage throughout 2 days, and you're here.
Thank you.
With that, I'm delighted to pass the mic on and actually change this monologue into a discussion by inviting my peers and speakers to contextualize the panel's topic. and specific best practices from their own respective sectors and projects. So I'll start with Kirsty, then go to Mark, and finally Monica.
So I work very, very closely with Malvika, and I'm sort of slightly tempted to just say, yes, that's exactly what we want to work on, that's exactly what we want to do. But I think instead I'll say that the Turing Way, we say it so often, and so many people, 400 contributors, but thousands of people who have read it and used it around the world, we sort of use the name so much that we forget actually sort of what it means. And it can be interpreted as a directive. This is what the Turing Institute says you should be doing. And there's a little bit of that, for sure. The book started as a recommendation around reproducibility. And reproducibility does not fix all of the problems, but from my personal perspective, it is the low bar that we should all be able to clear. One should be able to get the same answer with the same data, answering the exact same question a second time around. And it's unbelievable how few people can do that. And when you dig into it, it's because there are actually sort of quite a few thorny, gnarly sort of skills, for example, around version control, around using Git, around writing sort of programming code in the first place, your software code, thinking about making your data sets kind of well documented, thinking about your computational environment, and like, oh wow, now you can start to really sort of see that there are a lot of these skills that are required to, quote unquote, just get the same answer again. So the book started originally as kind of a way of saying, we really want you to jump over this very low hurdle of getting the same answer a second time, and we're here to be able to help you to do that. And as the book has expanded, this was actually Malvika's innovation when she joined a few years ago, we've tried very hard to turn the Turing Way into less of a directive and more of a journey. So thinking more of the Turing Way, that you can all walk along with us, because the change in the world is not about do everything perfectly. The change is having every member of the ecosystem reflect on the part that they can play in the ecosystem to improve it, and contributing into an openly developed book to share learnings so that others have a higher jumping off point is the change that we want to make.
Okay, thank you for that. Was that actually a question, or do you want me to sort of build on what
if you could contextualize, what does this mean to you in your own field, in your sector?
Okay, so my background is well, I was originally an undergraduate chemist, then I went on and did physics, a PhD in physics, so I've been there pretty much ever since. I guess I asked why too many times, and that's why I ended up in physics. And so, so I've seen over the years, and I've had quite a long association with Imperial College. I was there as a PhD student. I did leave, but I've been there as a researcher, and I'm now an academic staff member, and so on. And I've seen the role, or at least the influence, that AI has played in both the research and also in terms of interests, even from students. In a lot of their final year projects, they want to do it on AI. And in fact, very recently, we've just appointed a new lecturer in the astrophysics group, but their specialism is in AI. So we know that AI is, and this is just, if you like, a narrow field. And when we think more broadly, I've run projects with students who have used, let's say, evolutionary programming and applied it to things like music production and so on, as well as on education research. We've looked at ways of using machine learning and AI to understand natural language processing from student feedback and so on, so that we can get a much better understanding of the underlying patterns and correlations in terms of their thinking about particular modules and courses and so on. So I say all this to basically say that there's no doubt in my mind that the trend is only going to increase, and AI is going to play a more and more important role in all of our lives, whether we are technically minded or not. And so that leads me to say, well, will AI be reflective of the people whom it will ultimately serve, which is basically society at large? And I think that's where I think the responsibility of if you like, to some extent, of those who are tasked with developing these powerful instruments and tools which are going to affect all of our lives, how much of the, if you like, how much of the inclusive nature of what they do is factored in, or whether that's something we just have to rely on any particular individual to bring to the table. And so to me, I think that's a conversation which is good to have at this stage, rather than, several years down the line, when a lot of these things will be effectively already implemented in society, and it's much harder to sort of change once it sort of gets its own, it gathers its own wings, if that makes sense. So that's where my perspective is coming from. It started from a sort of physics perspective, and I can see the benefits and the influence it's having in that particular area of research, but I don't lose sight of the fact that actually it's going to influence many areas, and I'm just, I wouldn't say concerned might be the wrong word, but I'm definitely interested to see how those who are tasked with developing these tools are going to account for the fact that that there may well be inherent bias in many of the areas that they develop, and how you mitigate against that. So I think I'll sort of leave it there, and it's a bit of thought-provoking ideas, but that's just my perspective based on what you've said so far.
Thank you, Mark. Monica, over to you.
Thanks, Malvika. So I am Assistant Director of Open Climate, running a campaign called the Open Climate Campaign, whose ultimate goal is to have the open sharing of research in climate science be the norm. And that is built on this foundational principle where we argue that if we're going to solve the world's greatest problems, then the knowledge about them needs to be open. A really pressing problem, a really present problem, is climate change. And we currently have researchers working on better understanding processes of climate change, generating solutions, mitigation strategies to combat the effects of climate change. But because of incentives and structures that are present in scholarly communication, in academia, a lot of those solutions and knowledge is behind a paywall, or not accessible, or just not easily shared. And so when we're thinking about skills and stakeholders, a really big stakeholder are those scientists, those researchers, the support staff that maintain infrastructure, and having them have the skills and be equipped to have skills to make their work open. And so what we're doing at the Open Climate Campaign is first doing some advocacy and talking to researchers and scientists and the support staff to really impart on them the importance of the work that they are doing, and how particularly important it is that the work that they are doing is as open as possible, is as accessible as possible. But that can only happen if we equip them with the tools and the knowledge and the training to make their work open. So what we're doing is also connecting these researchers with projects like the Turing Way, like OpenScapes, like NASA's new TOPS curriculum, so that they're equipped with the skills to be able to make their work across the research lifecycle as open as possible.
Thank you. That was such a great segue to the next question. I'm so happy. You're making my job easier, because the title of this talk is Individual Skills, and it starts with that, right? So I would like to invite you all, and I'll start with Monica, if you would share what specific skills and practices can individual stakeholders of data science and AI, just what they should embed in their work. What are these skills?
Yeah, I often like to think about it across the research lifecycle. And so I sort of envision it as, a circle, and these are constructs, but if you divide the research process into pieces, you've got sort of like discrete events. You have ideation, you've got the data generation and collection, you've got publication, and then the communication aspect of it. And each part of that life cycle, and very sort of coarse terms, can have skills to make that element more open. And I think what we need to work on and continue to offer is opportunity for researchers to learn skills on, how do I make my methods open? How do I engage in reproducibility? How do I, get more data science skills, programming skills? How do I understand copyright? And I think that's a particularly important aspect when we're also talking about artificial intelligence, right? Like that is something we're thinking about a lot at Creative Commons. What's the role of Creative Commons, and how could we make copyright more accessible so that people understand what it is? Because we believe that open licensing can lead to better sharing. AI also potentially could lead to better sharing, but we still have to respect copyright and the rights of artists and creators. So, these are all skills that we aren't really taught when we go through like a traditional education system. I went through a PhD in ecology, and I didn't get any of this training as part of the curriculum, as part of the, the courses that I had to take in order to receive my degree. I had to go and seek out those courses or those trainings or those workshops, and I'm really grateful that they existed. I'm really grateful for the kind of funding that exists to make these things possible, like the Turing Way. And I think we need to continue to support those, and then think about what are ways in which we can embed these really important skills that we need, not only to do research, but to do research better, and that can lead us to more open sharing.
Thank you. Would you like to share your thoughts, Mark, please?
Yeah, sure. So individual skills, I suppose you could look at it from different contexts, and it's important to know what we mean in what context. So, for example, individual skills could be the skills you need to become a better data scientist or researcher, which is potentially very technical, which I'm not going to comment on because you'll probably know more about what you need in that area than me. But then there's also individual skills in terms of that will allow to produce, if you like, to have an impact, okay, to have a sort of global impact. There's also individual skills that could develop your career, and I'm not even going to talk about that because this is really individual skills for global impact. And to me, it's around how, as an individual, can you really influence something on a global scale, or at least be more in a position to do that? And I suppose if you look at the reality, most of us as individuals are not in a position to simply send out a diktat and things just happen. We have to influence people, influence the influencers, so to speak. So I think a key individual skill for global impact, especially as maybe an early career researcher or so, is actually to be able to learn how to influence both up and down the chain, because it's going to be very important. Often, you may see solutions or ways of addressing particular issues, but then the decision maker is someone who may be so many layers above you. And you've got to find ways of influencing them to make the decision that will allow you to achieve that global impact. So that's where I would say it's more around people skills often, and maybe that's something that can sometimes be overlooked in very technical areas, but I think it's key if we really want to make global impact, as well as obviously the technical skills that you need to gain the credibility in your area of expertise.
And Kirsty?
I could not agree with that answer more, and also Monica's. So I think I will add on top, but heavily plus oneing both of those. I'll add on top that we sort of, at least in the UK where I was educated, the way that we're taught maths and science encourages people to be techie or not techie at a sort of terrifyingly early age. And it becomes a mindset of saying, these things are hard and these things are, and if anyone wants to sort of see me stand on a soapbox and lecture you for a long time, you can say soft skills, because I would say those people skills, those collaborative skills are way harder than the technical skills. But there is this, there's sort of like a hierarchy, and there's certainly a separation between people who feel confident working with data, working with computers, and those who don't. And so I think one skill that's inside of Mark's answer is stepping into a space, having the courage to step into a space and say, I can learn that, and I want to be able to ask the questions, to ask for help on that. Things like the technical skills for reproducibility, some of the sort of thinking about how to be tactical with what questions are you answering in order to make sure that it's actually sort of going to translate to something that has meaning. And then the one that I would sort of add on top is managing upwards and influencing upwards is really, really fantastic, and it's extremely powerful. And also, there are some people who are at the very top in the senior decision-making layers who are not representative of the rest of society and all of the different diversity that it contains. And so you may also need the skill of saying, even though you are more senior than me, you are not in fact right. And figuring out how you influence upwards and also advocate for change is a very, very challenging skill, but it has to happen. It has to be a confidence on an individual basis in order to build the solidarity to really make a global change.
Thank you. As an early career researcher, I feel that last point so much. And I feel like all postdocs feel this, right? If you find something that your senior person doesn't agree with, you're like, oh man, here I go. So we have these skills, but how can we ensure that our efforts are actually translated into collective actions, resulting in the socially responsible research and driving the systemic change? So how can we go from this and ensure that whatever we do on an individual level actually can be built up into a more collective result? So I'll start this time with Mark.
Okay, quite a question to unpack, really. But basically, I mean, I would say that in terms of how we could, I mean, it's hard to ensure sort of global impact particularly, but what I would say is that in terms of your skill set, if you are influencing the influencers, then effectively one of the things that I think helps, because you may sometimes have to, as Kirsty says, they may not necessarily have the same lived experiences or even life experiences as you, but yet you want them to make decisions that might affect people from a demographic, however you define it, which is not like them. And so how do you do that? Well, I think one of I suppose the general thing is to try and speak the same language. And what I mean by that is use your own sort of skill set. So, for example, data. Data is a very powerful way of sometimes getting the message across, especially if it can be validated, verified data that points to a particular type of inference. Because it's very hard for, as we know, to argue against numbers if they are, well researched and presented in the right way. So that's one aspect. And then I would say more broadly, it's more of a mindset thing, because we often hear this phrase, science and society, and it gives this impression as though the scientists are somewhere over here doing their science, and then once it's ready, they unleash it on society, as though society don't have a stake in what's going on, and scientists themselves are not members of society. And I think we need to change that mindset, and if we actually thought of ourselves as, more cohesive or more holistic, then I think a lot of the issues that then sort of arise would be less likely to arise, because we're already factoring in some of that societal thinking at the research stage. And similarly for society, I'm not going to let them completely off the hook, even though we are obviously all part of society, is that I think it's just as important for society to become slightly more, I'd say, technically literate. And I don't mean they all have to do degrees in whatever, but it just means being more technical, being aware of what research is going on, what the potential impact is, and impact can be. And it kind of leads into Monica's issue around open access to knowledge, because I see research as a culmination of the body of knowledge of, let's just say, humans globally over centuries. So why should that be sort of locked away for an elite few who have access, when in fact, we are all students of the world to some extent? And so if we were to sort of diversify that, or at least make it more open, you probably would find more innovative solutions and ways of addressing particular issues.
Thank you. Would you like to build on that, Kirsty, please?
Yeah. So building on this point from Mark about the fact that like scientists are in fact also members of society, and science, if it is supposed to make a positive change in the world, will have to bring in and sort of represent the needs of all members of society. One of the things that was very sort of formative in kind of my career pathway was this reflection on the idea that in the current system, what's good for an individual researcher is not in fact good for science as a whole, nor for science and society or its translation, because we have a very individualistic assessment system. So we sort of look to say, what did you do? What was your innovation? And we also heavily, heavily prize novelty. So as a system, we really like saying, what did you do that's better? What did you do that's new? What did you do that outperformed others? And the problem with that is that that's only a very sort of, that's a very competitive, and it's a very narrow definition of sort of the directions that we can take the research. And if those are the incentives, which sort of largely they mostly are, then why would anyone spend time delivering some skills training? Why would you bother to write down the documentation to accompany your code? Why would you bother to make your data accessible? Why would you welcome a new member of, I mean, maybe you'd welcome a new member of your team if they were going to help you, but why would you welcome the person in the team next door? Why would you show them how to use the coffee machine? Why would you introduce them to different digital skills? And it's because we don't sort of currently reward people for those behaviors. To be very clear, many, many researchers around the world do in fact welcome people into their buildings and show them how the coffee machine works and introduce them. And many, many people, probably the vast majority of people in this room, deliver skills trainings, whether that's sort of formal skills trainings or help and answering questions and sort of provide, debugging and providing support. But we have traditionally struggled to incentivize those. And so what we're doing, and this is something that Malvika talked about a little bit in her introduction, her overview, was that we're building at the Turing Institute, inside of this Tools, Practices and Systems research program that I lead, different types of research careers. So one of the most established, which wasn't started at the Turing Institute, was research software engineers. So these are people who are traditionally, quote unquote, the middle authors of papers. They're extraordinarily valuable human beings. They have loads of knowledge about the data. They have loads of statistical knowledge. They've written a bunch of code. They've version controlled it. They can find it. They can reuse it. But because that work is not technically the novelty, they are often sort of appreciated but not incentivized. They often don't get promoted, and there wasn't, before a research software engineering sort of title was created, there wasn't a career path for them to progress. They could stay in that sort of space, possibly feel good that they were doing important work, which they were, but never really earn enough money to pay for their mortgage on their house, for example. So, so we are really passionate about supporting research software engineers, and also diversifying some of the thinking into, like Malvika said, her team of research community managers. So those are people who sort of build connections, who make introductions, who can see gaps in what's needed, and whether that's skills related, maybe it's some of that translating jargon, whether that's sort of thinking about different perspectives. We also have a team of research application managers, and they work on sort of helping research teams to articulate the value of their research to potential users. So it's still a community sort of piece of work, but maybe you could think of community managers as thinking about the creators coming all together, and the research application managers working with the users. And in the limit, I personally would really like to see those come even closer. I would like to see everyone working together, but there's different on-roads, there's different ramps. So we have our research software engineers, we have our research community managers, research application managers. At the Institute, we also have data wranglers who are data specialists. And then I want to sort of pitch one more, which I think are the research program managers. So these are people who have traditionally been kind of kept as support staff. They are there to, help the researchers. And I suppose what I'm really excited about is incentivizing career pathways where they take on some of those important responsibilities of keeping a project on track and are also recognized as integral members of the research team, because it's all of us working together that will get us to global impact.
Thank you. Monica, I'll pass to you to add.
Yeah, I really love what the Turing Institute is doing, because I also recognize that, for example, like my position, it's not a traditional academic position, it's not a support position, but my position needs to exist if we're going to push these skills, if we're going to transform the way that we do science, research, innovation, if we're going to move to open being the norm. And I'd love to see that happen in parallel with also changing the reward system from sort of that individualistic to a more of a collective reward, to reward people for doing the, learning these skills, doing the metaphorical sharing of the intricacies of the coffee machine by rewarding people for teaching, for sharing those skills. And that needs to change in the tenure and promotion processes across institutions, across different universities, different colleges, so that we reward those skills. And I think that needs to happen in parallel with also, creating these types of positions that don't fit into this very narrow mold that hasn't been changed for hundreds of years. And then I think the third parallel should be that we also should communicate to these knowledge producers how their impact can be felt, and the impact that they're making, and how working with these skills can also make their research better, even for yourself. I remember the first time I ran an R script after I changed a data frame, and it ran all by itself. And I was like, oh my God, it's like I just doubled myself. I had double the amount of time now. And that was, enough to hook me at the start. And just also knowing that, the work that I do could have a really big impact when it comes to policy decisions. Before I moved over to Creative Commons, I was a senior policy advisor at the Government of Canada. And I was so used to being able to access any paper I wanted when I was part of an academic institution. And I remember the first time sitting at my desk trying to read a paper and hitting a paywall and not knowing what to do. I didn't know how to get that paper. I was going to have to ask a friend who was still in an institution, and that's what I did. And I'm the one that needed to get that information so that I could get it to a decision maker. So also I think imparting the importance of that, showing people how your knowledge translates to policy decisions and the importance of having that knowledge be accessible, I think can also instigate change and catalyze change. But I think all of these things have to happen in parallel, because I think we've been pushing for the adoption of these skills, for people to take them on their own. And like Kirsty said, some people, a lot of people have been doing this. A lot of people have been doing, the teaching and training, sharing advice about the coffee machine, but not enough, because we still have only about 50% of papers are open access, for example, as a metric. So I think all of these things need to happen in parallel, because it needs to change fast, because we need access to that knowledge to generate the solutions to problems that are accelerating.
I have so much vigorous nodding, and Monica, if you can't see the stage, there's a lot of nodding going on. Really, I agree with all of what we've heard. Just to add to Monica's point, I was watching a documentary on open access, and there was a person who was interviewing people around, and he went to a particular lab, and they said, oh, why do you do this research? because they said that this is the only field that publishes papers openly. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that you're not able to do research in any other area because you don't have access to those knowledge? How limiting could that be? And we're talking about people who are academic, but as Monica is saying, that what if your policy isn't being fully informed? How horrifying, how unethical. I think some points Mark also said, and Kirsty, you also said, which I relate very well. When I was doing, initially, my goal was to become very good coder, to do my bioinformatics research. And when I got into the training, I was like, oh, this is very cool. I'm going to become an instructor because I like teaching. And then I became instructor and suddenly realizing, oh, people have access issues. Oh, science is social. Oh, there's equity problem. So like this equity that we want to build through these skill building and by bringing people together, I think some of the questions that we need to ask, and I'm really quoting my favorite book called Contextualizing Openness, and I happened to meet Denise from Royal Society, who's one of the authors. How cool is that again? But the question is, to whom does knowledge belong? Who benefits from the production and circulation of research outcomes? Who gets to participate in the production process? And in what ways can research be used to increase agency of more people over knowledge production? So when we talk about data science and AI, we kind of forget that at the base level, it's all about knowledge. Have we shared enough information with the people that they understand that it's their human rights to ask where my data is being used? Do they understand that they have right over their own information? And often, what Kirsty, you were saying, there is a tech and non-tech. Suddenly, you're a scientist and you're social, where therefore you cannot question how we use your data because we know better than you. I think that's the problem of when we're trying to get people to come together with us to do collective action. We need to bring them in, have a longer conversation. Okay, I'm going to move on to the last one. Very loving this conversation. It's the most important part of this conversation, the final one, where the impact comes in. Using examples from your own respective sectors, can you share how these skills and practices translate into tangible global impact? And this time, let me go back. Who do I start with? I'm going to start with Monica, with you.
Yeah, I'd love to point to the Open Climate Campaign as a really concrete example of how that basically is our narrative, that the work that you are doing, if you embed these skills into the work that you're doing, you will have a bigger impact on perhaps the world's greatest problem, which is climate change. And we want to enable you to do this by connecting you with skills. We also want to change the system of funding so that open access is prioritized, is facilitated, is encouraged by funders and governments and organizations, because the work that knowledge producers in climate change, and that it encompasses so many disciplines because climate change is so unique in that way that it has the potential to affect every discipline and every human on the planet. That if you use these skills, you will make it easier to access that knowledge, and that can catalyze the generation of solutions to one of the world's greatest problems, if not the greatest problems. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons why I love doing this work. I think these types of global problems can be overwhelming. And when you think about it from an individual scale, what can I do as a single individual, particularly because these problems require, sort of that like high level decision making to have big global impact. But I feel that this is such a tangible thing that we can do to help decision makers, to help collective action towards helping us mitigate and solve climate change, for example.
Mark?
Okay, so I suppose I could maybe talk about some of my research experience in air quality monitoring, developing the instrumentation, founding a technology company back in 2008, which is still going now, definitely having a global impact. But actually, I'm not going to talk about that. I'd actually want to talk about more around equity and inclusion, because there was a research question which I think only I asked myself when I was a PhD student, which was, why are there not more people like me doing subjects like physics at places like Imperial? Now, it's a very simple question, but actually when you start to try and explore why that is, and when I say people like me, just for some context, my parents came to the UK from the Caribbean in the late 60s, etc. And so I could easily have convinced myself I was the first of a wave of students, like me, who were going to be sort of in that space. But then when I returned as a postdoc and so on, many years later, I saw nothing had really changed, at least statistically. So once I started to explore that question, I realized obviously that the issues are much earlier in the pipeline, but then there's still that frustration to say, well, what can I do as an individual? And when I was doing physics, I didn't know any other black physicists at all. I just didn't know any. It didn't really necessarily bother me or stop me from doing what I wanted to. I just wondered why there wasn't. But I suppose what I then realized was that once I became part of the teaching staff, there were, let's say, a small handful of undergraduate physicists who were going to be going through that same experience. And so I started to sort of unofficially mentor them and recognize that they could also be very useful for outreach and mentoring younger students. And even once they graduated, they would then be useful to mentor the current undergraduates. And so that's how we built up this, shall we say, critical mass of like-minded individuals with a passion for physics and, let's say, their community. And it was only over time that we were able to then become more formal. And now there is, in terms of what, let's say, the Blackett Lab family, which was formed a few years ago, but started many years ago, they've submitted a parliamentary submission into equity in STEM. They've got memorandums of understanding with the IOP. They've had articles in the BBC and the Voice newspaper, etc. They've connected with lots of African-American physicists. So in other words, there is now a voice in a space that most people didn't even know existed. So that's what I would say was, going back to the original early question about individual skills, it wasn't necessarily my technical skills that allowed that to be achieved. It was the people skills and navigating that sort of, that space, both diplomatically, but with a clear mind that you want to make a tangible difference for the next generation. So I think I'll sort of use that as an insight, and I'm sure that could be applied in many other fields. I'm just using my own lived experience as an example.
Kirsty.
So I feel that my example is really sort of sad compared to that really beautiful example, but I am going to stick with it because actually it converges into saying that everybody has a role to play and everybody needs to feel included and invited in order to hit, like you said, that critical mass of people who are participating in the creation of science research for global impact. So I want to shout out the open data software ecosystem. So I'm most familiar with the Python ecosystem, and so I want to shout out the Python language itself, which is an open source programming language. I want to shout out Matplotlib, which is a visualization tool. It's totally open source. It's created by a global community of contributors. I want to shout out numerical Python, NumPy, SciPy. These are pieces of code that are almost so foundational that people forget that they were written by human beings. I think a more tangible open source community might be scikit-learn. So that's a Python-based machine learning toolkit. And so much is built on top of that. And that is human created and, most importantly, maintained infrastructure for, I don't think it's all of our data science ecosystem, but it's way more than half. It's a huge, huge amount of sort of downstream impact that maybe gets sort of sensationalized and is sort of held up as these fantastic AI tools. But underneath is this code that was written by often volunteers around the world. And those projects, so like SciPy, NumPy, Python, R, scikit-learn, they can look so big as to be impossible to participate in. You know, you just sort of think like, wow, that's amazing. You know, you must be so smart to be able to participate in that. You must know so much. Or maybe some people think, well, that's their project. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. It's absolutely amazing. But how could I take part in it? And really, the sort of secret, but it's not very secret because I'm saying it on stage. The secret goal of the Turing Way project is not actually to create a book that people can read and use and learn from. It's actually to provide a sandpit and a space where people can learn what it means to contribute to an open source project. And the, again, not very secret goal is that if those people then took those skills, took that confidence, and started to contribute to other open source projects, we would sustain and support a much healthier and very, very globally impactful open source ecosystem.
That was really good. I'm sorry. We're running out of time, so we don't have time for questions from the audience. I just want to point out that a lot of the questions were regarding industry because we talk a lot about research here. So I want our panelists to keep to know those questions, and we can email you the questions if you want to have a look at how they ranged. But they were a lot of them were about how industry is, and that's also it's a whole other question, right? Because of open science in industry. So I guess we are going to invite our speakers to just give a quick, just the final words that you want people to take home.
So I would actually say, don't imagine. There are definitely funders in the room. There are definitely government in the room. There are policymakers in the room. There are doers in the room. What do you want them to take out from this conversation? What is your secret goal in life that they should bring back to their own community? And if you could close with that, each speaker. And I think, Kirsty, we start with you for that.
Stop spending money on closed source software. Thank you.
Oh, good one. Mark.
Make sure you foster an environment to allow all staff members to be their authentic selves, because that's how you'll get the best productivity.
Monica.
The system that we operate, whether that's in academia or in industry, I remind you, it's a construct. It's not a natural law. We can change it. We are working on this critical mass so that we change this particular construct, and it's not immovable. We can change it, and we need everybody's help and collective action to do it, and all of our projects are trying to do that, and we would love some fuel to accelerate that.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'm going to call B. What would be your lesson?
No, you're putting me on the spot. I didn't prepare anything. I think my lesson as an earlier career, what I take is that we don't need to be daunted by how big all the tasks are, but it's just about our own experience and that our voice matters, even if we feel like it's really small and really early and very, very, very young. So that's what I'll take. Thank you for asking me.
What's yours?
Oh, well, I definitely think that we all have a skill, Kirsty. That's the secret sauce. We all should feel that my skill is relevant for someone else. Create that experience for one person, and that person will create that experience for someone else. They'll create it for someone else and someone else. And that's going to be the impact that you would have. Don't think about that changing one person's life isn't the global impact.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to us. Sorry that we ran out of time. The conversation was designed for 3 questions, but it just was very interesting. And our speakers are still here. Please grab them. Monica, one of the nicest human in the earth. Please contact her if you want to talk to her about her work. We'd love to hear from you. There's the Turing Way stand, free stickers, if you like a sticker on your laptop. And with that, I'll close. Thanks so much.
I mean, you already did everything, so I will thank everyone and thank the audience for joining us, the audience online as well, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to the questions. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank again
Thank
to
you.
the panelists.
Yay.
Thank you for inviting me.